أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Our dearest brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh, and welcome back to another session. And you probably will have recalled that we kind of left the last one, I wouldn't say inconclusively, but certainly not as dramatically as we typically like to leave our podcasts. But that was for a reason. That's because we kind of split up what I was actually going to do as one full session. The last one was getting a little bit long, and I didn't want to just blast through this next topic, which I think is quite important. So we kicked off on this journey on Adala. We started to try and define it, to look at justice versus injustice, to go into a bit more detail as to why this is such an important usul. Like why is it an usul, but also from the characteristics that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has. Why is it that Adala is picked to be within our usul, and how it relates to the likes of imama, so on and so forth. We then looked at justice versus equality, so there's a lot of definitions and comparisons going on, but where we didn't manage to conclude was on this topic of where does God fit into all of this. So within this topic of justice, injustice, or equality, the source of injustice, so on and so forth, putting things in its rightful place, where does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sit within all of this? And of course, I mean metaphorically sit. So we're going to try and understand today the reasons for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's justice. And one theme that we picked up on in the last session was that there is a difference of opinion within different schools of thought in Islam as to whether we are able to decipher between what is rational goodness and unseemliness, between something that would be just and something that isn't just. And we gave quite an extreme example, but whilst it's extreme, it's quite a strong evidence actually that we can decipher in life between things that are just and unjust to a decent degree, not perfectly, but to a decent degree. And that was the example of the Holy Prophet, after all of his incredible service towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or being this incredible perfect slave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If, wala'udhu billah, he would be sent to hell, we would be able to say, that's a bit weird, right? That is probably not justice. Our wisdom is able to realize and understand that there is a difference between something that is just, goodness, versus something that is unjust, that is full of unseemliness to a certain degree. Within us, all of us know that justice and kindness, they're good and admirable characteristics, right? They're things that we are attracted to innately. And on the opposing side, injustice and jealousy are bad and repulsive. We know this without any religious instruction. You can go to work or university, you could be on the train, and if you see someone, take the seat on the train that a pregnant lady could have been sat on, you'd be like, oh, that's a bit weird. We don't need religious instruction in order to tell us that is unjust, that is unfair. However, there are things that we couldn't understand through the sciences alone, and to recognize them, we need the instruction of religious leaders such as the prophets and the Imam Ali. And we'll discuss this a little bit when we look at Nubuwah and Imama, but just to help us understand this concept a little bit more. And therefore, we're able to quite concretely conclude that the Asharite school of thought, those who, as we said in the last session, don't believe that we're able to decipher between rational goodness and unseemliness, between justice or not, and that it doesn't exist, this injustice doesn't exist, it's quite clear that they are wrong in denying rational goodness and unseemliness. It actually just doesn't make any rational sense to even put forward that opinion whatsoever. A child is able to decipher it to an old man who's got many, many years of wisdom, or woman, or whatever. Anyone's able to decipher that, right? If we were unable to decipher between goodness and unseemliness, then how could we know whether God gave miracles to a liar or to an honest person? And just reflect on that for a moment. That's how basic this argument is, right? If we were unable to decipher between goodness and unseemliness, how would we know, how could we know whether God gave these amazing miracles like the Quran to a liar or to the most honest person that had ever lived, i.e. the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? We recognize, right, that lying is bad. It's uncharacteristic of God. It's unseemly. It's not good. And that God's statements are always flawless. He always keeps his promises. We know, therefore, that God wouldn't provide a miracle to a lie. We're able to deduce this. Hence, we can trust a religion and conclude that goodness and unseemliness is an absolute foundation of our faith. So we put to bed that thought that this concept of justice is not is non-existent. Rather, it is existent. We are able to decipher it to a decent degree, and there are things that we're unable to decipher through the traditional sciences, and therefore it necessitates some sort of guide, some sort of divinely appointed guides, which will be a time for a conversation for another time, i.e. the prophets and the Imam Ali. So if we now accept that we can differentiate to a decent degree between justice and injustice, the question arises, what is the source of injustice? Where does it come from? And eventually we'll start to realize how and where Allah fits into this picture. So what is the source of injustice? Ayatollah Naser presents a few different things, and you'll start to see a repeated theme here. One of these sources of injustice is, for example, ignorance. A cruel person or a tyrant doesn't really know what he's doing. He doesn't realize that he's destroying others, completely unaware of it. That is one source of injustice. They don't know that their actions are necessarily having such a detrimental impact on others in society. A second source of injustice could be through need, i.e. sometimes we want to possess things which actually belong to others, and in such scenarios we might be tempted to become involved in injustice through hasad, through jealousy. And then we look at the story of Cain and Abel, Habil and Qabil, and the way that one brother kills the other just because of jealousy. They have a need. They wanted what the other person had. Another area where injustice comes from is through incompetence or inability to do something. We may not be willing to deprive others of their rights, but we can't help it, and unwittingly we get involved in injustice without even realizing it sometimes. Another is selfishness and revenge. Sometimes it's none of these that we've just mentioned, ignorance, need, incompetence, inability, but actually it's our selfish needs causing us to try and usurp the rights of others. Our ego takes over, our desire for revenge takes over. We're unable to control these inner faculties that we have, that Allah has given us to either leverage towards goodness, but if it takes over us in the wrong way, it can completely turn us into beasts, very, very frightening beasts. That can be another source of injustice. And I think it'd be very easy for us to pick out many examples across the world today where you see this selfishness causing us to usurp on the rights of others. And just to use a topical example, I think just last night or this morning there was a news article saying that the US government are going to give a whole load of cash from the state of Afghanistan to the 9/11 victims. Now, whilst you could say compensating the 9/11 victims for what they had to go through, whatever caused it, let's accept that they lost loved ones unjustly. There is zero proof to suggest that any of those awful human beings or beasts that were involved in that savage murder were to do with the state of Afghanistan. So why all of a sudden, through this selfishness and revenge that is so ill-placed, they were able to go and take money from that country and just give it over to other people? That is frankly stealing, right? So we can see that the source of injustice comes from these different situations, these different feelings like ignorance or a need or an incompetence and inability, or even as worrying as selfishness and revenge. So how, therefore, do we start to fit God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, into the equation of justice and injustice? Well, we just went through where injustice comes from, what the sources of injustice are. And we recognize that actually God has none of those defects. Go back to our session on Tawheed. God has none of those defects. He's all-knowing. He's in need of nothing. He's all powerful. He's so merciful. He doesn't need anything. It's irrational to think that an entity that is in need of nothing would ever get involved in tyranny or injustice, that such an entity would pursue something. Because he doesn't need it, he has it. God is infinite. Perfection has no limit. We only expect benevolence, justice, kindness, affection from such a source of divine mercy. Nothing short of that. And because he has it all in infinite amounts, he doesn't need to go and chase it. Therefore, he will not have those characteristics of ignorance or being in need or incompetence or inability or selfishness or revenge. That doesn't exist with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, if those are the sources of injustice, if he doesn't have those, then he is not a source of injustice. He is not connected to injustice himself. And that is a really important point for us to realize and actualize, because, and we'll mention this in the coming sessions, it's so often, and just look at the way our language has been concocted, if you like. If something happens to someone and they give you bad news, one of the most common reactions that we hear someone say is like, oh God, oh, for God's sake. For some reason, God is at the blame of an injustice that has occurred. When it's got nothing to do with it. Literally, it's got nothing to do with it. But we'll come on to that in the coming days. But this is a very important point to conclude on. So now we've recognized that injustice can exist, but it arises from those characteristics that some people may have and act upon. We see that there are evildoers in the world who do go around and usurp people's rights and cause injustice. And these evildoers are to be punished. But here's a very interesting point. It's not God who punishes them. What? It's not God who punishes them? Who punishes them then? They did something wrong. They caused an injustice. They took something from its rightful place and placed it elsewhere. They took your money that you earned in a halal way and they took it somewhere else. They spent it on their t-shirt, their car, their family, whatever. But now we're saying it's not God who punishes them. So who punishes them? Ayatollah Naser puts this in a beautiful way. When we see evildoers punished, it isn't God who punishes them. Rather, their punishment is, in fact, the consequence of their wrong. They've brought it amongst themselves. It's similar to the punishment of death, which an addict receives because of his addiction and due to his use. So if someone is sniffing cocaine every single day of their life, I'm not a doctor, but I'm assuming that's probably not going to end very well for them at some point. You wouldn't blame, the drug dealer necessarily. I mean, you could, but you can get the point I'm getting at. It's that individual's choice that he is going to seek those drugs, take them every day when he knows that he's going to die one day because of this addiction. It's his own doing that is creating this eventual punishment. Death isn't to be punished. This person's brought it amongst themselves. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah An-Naml, Surah 27 verse 90 says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Hal tujzawna illa ma kuntum ta'malun. Shall you be rewarded for anything except what you did? It's on you. It's on your shoulders. You need to accept that. And we see this concept of God's justice coming up so many times in the Quran. And I'm sure, especially with the holy month of Shahr Ramadan soon approaching, you're no foreigner to this concept either. But you can look towards, for example, Surah Yunus, Surah number 10, verse 34. Inna Allah la yadhlimu an-nas shay'a. وَلَكِنَّ النَّاسَ أَنفُسَهُمْ يَظْلِمُونَ. Indeed, Allah does not wrong the people at all, but it is the people who are wronging themselves. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَظْلِمُ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ. Indeed, Allah does not do injustice even as much as an atom's weight. Surah An-Nisa, verse number 40. It's not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who brings this injustice. Rather, وَلَكِنَّ النَّاسَ أنفسهم يظلمون. But it is the people who are wronging themselves. It is us taking what Allah has given us in a good place, in a right place, and using it or placing it in a wrong place for the wrong reason. We are committing the injustice. We and our actions ourselves are causing the issue, and therefore we need to face the consequence. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it very clear so many times in the Quran that there's going to be this day of regret, this day where everything will be accounted for, this day where everything will be exposed and we'll have to answer, and our tongue will be tied, and our hands and our limbs and everything else, our body parts, will speak on behalf of themselves against us. Surah Al-Anbiya 21 verse number 47. وَنَضَعُ الْمَوَازِينَ الْقِسْطَ لِيَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ فَلَا تُظْلَمُ نَفْسٌ شَيْئًا. And we place the scales of justice for the day of resurrection, so no soul will be treated unjustly at all. There's this invitation to justice from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Man's attributes should be a reflection of God's attributes. We shouldn't have this ignorance. We shouldn't have this want to revenge. We shouldn't have all of these things that bring about injustice. Rather, our attributes should be a reflection of God's attributes, because we are being invited to justice and we should follow through. God's attributes should be felt among the members of any society, and we can see that they exist in every society, but how many people are acting upon them is a different question. Based on this principle, the Quran emphasizes both God's justice and justice among members of human society, and the Quran repeatedly considers injustice as the very essence of corruption in human society, and it predicts a painful fate for such cruel people. And there's the description of the fate of the people in the olden times who were destroyed due to their unjust deeds, which the Quran uses as a warning for people against practicing injustice and cruel acts. You just look to Surah An-Nahl, Surah number 16, verse number 90. إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي. Indeed, Allah orders justice and good conduct and giving to relatives, and forbids immorality and bad conduct and oppression. And it's worth mentioning that accepting cruelty or injustice from others is just as bad as doing it to others. Accepting it is just as bad as doing it to others. You can't see it happening and not stand up. That would be an injustice in and of itself. Because you're hearing someone being slandered and you're not standing up for them. Your ears, in their rightful place, if they hear something wrong, will tell your brain that you now need to act upon that and correct that wrong. And if you don't, then it's just as bad as doing it to others. لا تظلمون ولا تظلمون. Neither shall you make the debtor suffer loss, nor shall you be made to suffer loss. Surah Al-Baqarah 279. This submission to the unjust acts of cruel people is to encourage tyrants to engage in their devilish deeds even more. When we don't stand up, hayhat min nadhillah, never to this oppression and humiliation, never. We will never stand for it. We will never be silent for the injustice against Ahlul Bayt. We will never be silent to the injustice against anyone of the earth today, because we wish to bring around a society filled with justice. Because this was the revolution of Hussein and is the revolution of our awaited Savior, where we call toward goodness and we forbid evil. So we see, as a conclusion, that we as man are being called towards justice. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is adil, adala. This is one of the usul. It's critical. It's putting things in its rightful place. It's ensuring there is no discrimination. And we, as the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, feel attracted towards being just. And we need to ensure that we are just to our own souls, to our own selves, to our fitrah, to our nafs. Because there's going to be a day where we'll be called out for it, where we weren't, to ourselves and also to others. We know it's coming. And we can decipher between that which is goodness and justice versus that which is unseemly and unjust. So we can't say that we didn't know. Of course, there are some things that we need guidance on, and that's why the Anbiya and the Imam Ali exist to come and guide us. But from the basics, we can interpret it, even ourselves, without their guidance, if you like. Because it's in our fitrah. We're able to understand it and ascertain it and decipher between it. So inshallah, we're able to recognize the critical nature of this adala, of this principle of our faith. And it's then going to start triggering a whole set of interesting discussions in the next few podcasts in and around the concept of determinism or predestination and free will. And where do we sit between this? And that's a really, really fascinating discussion. So inshallah, you'll join us for the next podcast, inshallah. I hope this one has been beneficial. I think it was a good choice to split them, because otherwise it would have been 40 minutes or so for both. But here we go. We're just over the 20 minute mark. So let's leave it there. Pray for one another. Pray for Ayatollah Naser Makarem Shirazi for this amazing content that he has provided us with. And if there are any mistakes, as ever, please let me know so I can correct it. It's not my intention. And please forgive me for that shortcoming. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.